we dive into the details, I'd like us to take some time to step back and consider how to approach complex systems change. We face what I suppose would be called a wicked problem, and we need to open our minds and maybe think about it in different ways. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce you to Dr. Margaret Heffernan, who is going to be joining us today in our keynote conversation. A couple of years ago, I came across Margaret's book, Uncharted, which is all about uncertainty and thriving through times of change. And it completely inspired me and changed the way I looked at things, particularly around her challenge of asking us to resist those false promises of technology and efficiency and mine our creativity, mine our humanity to design the future that we want. In the Financial Times, Margaret said, "Our response to climate change cannot wait for the worst to strike, because even the fastest learning won't be fast enough. We must get ahead of the problem this decade, building resilience now, creating out of stasis something real to be optimistic about." And I'd like to invite Margaret up to the stage. She's a writer, an academic, a former CEO, an entrepreneur. She's going to come and have a keynote conversation with me to set us off. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm really glad to be here. It's a fantastic thing you're doing.
Thank you. So our community here and online today, we face a complex problem, and I wanted to ask you, how should leaders approach navigating change?
Well, I hope with enthusiasm and optimism. I think it's a particularly British characteristic. I've run businesses in the US and the UK to think change is kind of necessarily a terrible thing. I think given the state we're in right now, change is absolutely our best hope that we will get ourselves out of the mess in which we're presently stuck. Humans don't live in caves anymore because things change. That's the change narrative I wish we would spin more often. Exactly as you said and as your founder said at the opening, there is huge opportunity now for us to learn how to do things better, to leave the planet in a better state, not to be afraid of talking to our children about the future. I think this is a pretty exciting moment in which to be able to do truly radical thinking. So, you can tell I'm by nature an optimist. I also think I feel a deep moral urge to be an optimist. I think it's kind of morally repugnant not to be. I just think we need to do more of some of the great stuff that, some of the companies that you work with are doing, and make that infectious.
Yeah, and you've worked with lots of businesses and done lots of research. Could you share any examples with us of other businesses or other contexts where complex challenges like this have been faced and what's worked?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with one which is nothing to do with the climate crisis, just because it's a fantastic story and I think a real example of the benefits of experimentation. Because most companies, when I talk to them about experimentation, just think, either it sounds like an academic project, i.e. a total waste of time, or it sounds like something rather geeky and abstract. And this is not. So this is a Dutch healthcare system. I grew up in the Netherlands, and so I really like going back there to do research, let's be honest. And a huge amount of Dutch healthcare is based on home care nursing. They really don't want people to stay in hospital any longer than they can because hospitals are super expensive and they're very dangerous places. So they get people out as fast as possible. So that means they send nurses to people's homes during their recovery period. And the way that they were doing it was incredibly expensive. There was a second problem, which was the patients hated it and the nurses hated it. And they both hated it because of the way that it was being run. So nurses would get an assignment, go look after Mrs. Brown. You can see her for 8 minutes on Wednesday, 6 minutes on Friday, and the following Monday you can see her for 4 minutes, and then you should be done. This is exactly how home care is run in this country, by the way. And so the patients hated it because they felt they were trapped in a system that wasn't very responsive to them. And the nurses hated it because they felt like they were more taxi drivers than they were anything else. And one of the nurses, by a fluke of history, I guess, was a guy named Jos de Blok, who was a nurse, but formerly had been an economist. It's a strange career move,
Yeah.
right? And he'd left economics because he thought it was dreary and boring. And then he'd found out that home care nursing was dreary and boring. And so he thought, well, what can we do about it? And so he went and talked to the Dutch healthcare minister and brought some nurses to talk about the reality of this process. Everybody ended up in tears. Excellent way to start. And he said, I want to do an experiment. I just want to take 10 nurses and 40 patients and do this differently and see what happens. What I want to say to the nurses is just do whatever's right for the patient. That's it. And I want every single thing they do tracked and audited so we can see what the outcome is. Anyway, cut a long story short, that's what they did. What did he find out? He found that the cost of the system fell by 33% because patients got better in half the time. Now, there's no other way you can get to that outcome without doing the experiment. You could take your org chart and your flow charts and your Gantt charts and your Excel spreadsheets and fiddle from now till doomsday, and you'd never get there. You have to be willing to move towards pain points and do experiments before anybody tells you to. Not in a crisis, get ahead of the crisis and think, okay, what can we try? I mean, it was an alarmingly simple experiment to do. It's now totally transformed home care nursing in the Netherlands and in Taiwan and in Japan and all over the place. They're really struggling in the NHS because, of course, it's a redistribution of power. So that's very difficult for the NHS to stomach. But that's the power of experimentation. Completely different example, which is closer to the sort of stuff that I know that all of you are working on. So this is Maersk. Maersk is one of the biggest shipbuilders in the world, and they do container ships that take all this junk from one place to another, right? And when the COP was happening in Copenhagen, they realized that the company footprint was bigger, carbon footprint was bigger than the whole country's. So this was a really bad look. So the chief exec thought, holy hell, we have to do something about this. So he brought in his engineering team, and he said, I want you to see if you can design a ship that has reduces the carbon footprint by 20%. So they said, okay, well, we'll try, you know. Anyway, they went away, and they came back and said, well, actually, we've decided to do something different. This is always a good sign when people start thinking for themselves. They said, we think we should build a ship that's 20% bigger, but it uses half the fuel, and we're sure we can do it. And they did it. Now, this is great, right, because they'd actually taken a pretty kind of pathetic goal, really, and blown it out. The other thing that happened is, and this I've seen over and over and over again, is innovation drives innovation. When everybody starts saying everything's up for grabs, all sorts of things present themselves. So they also said, well, we can do cradle-to-grave passports for every single thing that goes into building these ships. So that's down to the last widget. And what that means is that when the ships eventually become decommissioned, we can recycle, and we know how to recycle every single thing that built it. They also found out that, you know, ships generate quite a lot of heat. They could recapture that and use that for energy. And they also, subsequent to this, are building the biggest ships they've ever built with the lowest carbon footprint because it runs on a new kind of fuel that is carbon neutral. So that's the sort of flywheel when you start experimenting and you start putting pressure on yourself to come up with something different. And I've seen that again and again, especially if you're involved in any kind of engineering. Engineers, and I know this having worked in software for a long time, engineers love nothing more than a hard problem. And what they want to do is not solve it, but come up with something kind of mind-blowing. And that's the kind of experimentation and innovation that you want to kick off.
Thank you. That takes me on to my next question around, you know, how can leaders, as people here today who might be running their own organizations and teams. How can leaders encourage and support their teams to be innovative and to take those kinds of risks?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, the first thing I'd do is I'd hearken back to the Montreal Protocol, because by a fluke of fate, I ended up having lunch with an old friend of mine. I didn't know he was involved in this at all. But anyway, he worked for ICI at the time of the Montreal Protocol, and ICI had a gigantic business in CFCs. Montreal Protocol comes along and says, you have to get rid of them. So, and he's a lawyer, right? He doesn't understand the chemistry of this at all. But he says, okay, well, we have to do this, and we have to come up with something that's going to replace the functions of CFCs. So he brings in his chief scientist and says, okay, how are we going to do this? He says, well, Jeff, the thing you have to understand is nobody knows how to do this. So all the standard management procedures, which are for things we know how to do, they won't work. Innovation cannot be managed the way that business as usual can be managed, because it won't follow a timetable or a budget. You don't know what you're doing, right? That's the whole point. So they came up with 3 principles. And the first was, we need everybody. So don't try to pick and choose the people. It's very well understood in innovation that the best ideas often come from people working outside their domain expertise. I've seen this in my own software company, gigantic engineering problem solved by a junior marketeer, right? Didn't know how to implement the solution, but could reframe it and come up with a way out, right? So first of all, we need everybody. And of course, this was 1989. I mean, that actually included women, which was not a given at the time within ICI. We need everybody. Everybody's voice must be heard. Secondly, we don't aim low. We don't try to lowball the problem. What we aim for as a solution is the best imaginable. And the third thing he said is, you have to butt out, because power is deeply disruptive to innovation. The minute a boss walks in the room, consciously or unconsciously, people start thinking, what does he or she want, and how can I provide the right answer? Now, so I said to Jeff, well, then what did you spend the time doing? And he said, well, I spent a lot of time giving my team air cover with the higher-ups, and I would sometimes sit in their meetings not saying anything to make sure that they honored those principles. This is the first company in the world to come up with an alternative to CFCs. They won every engineering medal going. It's still the thing he's most proud of. So I think those 3 kind of rules are really important. The other thing I would look at is a company like W.L. Gore, which is one of the companies with the highest patents per employee in the world, has been for decades. They have a really brilliant system, which is anybody can pitch an idea. And their product line goes everything from the Mars rover to Gore-Tex, right? I mean, it's completely unstrategic. They do so many incredibly different things. They're the world leaders in guitar strings also, right? This is really a polyglot kind of business. And it is that way because their employees come up with brilliant ideas. Yeah. And they have this fantastic rubric, because you want people coming up with ideas, but they have to be ideas that matter. Mm. And they should feel that whether the idea gets backing or not isn't a whim of, do they like me? Am I in with the in crowd? Whatever. So they just have 3 questions that every good idea has to be able to address. And the first is it real? Have you tested the idea enough to know that either it works or it makes a difference? The second is, does it matter? Is the market big enough for us to bother? And the third is, can we win? In other words, is this market so well defended by some big beasts that we have no chance? Or is it so disaggregated that we do have a chance? So there's one guy in Gore who, comes up with this idea. A lot of the Gore business is based on PTFE, which is a long molecule, which is what makes Gore-Tex water repellent. And he thinks, well, if I painted PTFE on my bike spokes, would it go faster? And the answer is yes, it will, because it'll repel grit and water, which slows it down. But by 1/100th of a second. The market for people who care about that, very small. So he thinks, okay, he's sitting at home disappointed, and he's playing his guitar, and he realizes his guitar's out of tune because the strings are old, and they get out of tune because they absorb the oil on your hands as you play. So he thinks, he has a one-track mind, this guy. If I painted the guitar strings with PTFE, would they last longer? So he tries that, and yes, indeed, they do last longer. They last about 10 times longer. Okay, does it work? Yes. Does it matter? Huge global market for guitar strings. Can we win? They're all mom and pop shop companies, right? Gore owns the guitar string market now. Now, there was no reason for them to go into the market except this guy comes up with an idea and obviously has a lot of hobbies. You know, he's a creative guy. But the point about Gore is, A, anybody can do that. It's not an R&D department. The whole business is an R&D department. That doesn't mean everybody comes up with ideas. A lot of people just help other people's ideas. But it's a way of thinking, and it's a way of identifying opportunities which may not necessarily be problems, but they are coming from everybody. And people don't have to kind of vote on ideas. They have to pass a test, which everybody knows, which is so simple that everybody can remember it, so they don't invest lots of love and attention on things that aren't going to work. So I think that's a pretty brilliant mindset. I'm a very big believer, and you referenced this in your introduction. We have to move to pain points before they're obviously a problem. And every single person in every company knows where they are. Mostly, they don't speak up because nobody asks them. They need to feel that when they see a system that doesn't work well, it's an opportunity to fix it. A fantastic example, John Hancock, which is a big US insurer, now basically says to all the people who deal with claims, any part of the system that doesn't work, come and propose an experiment for improving it. And anybody who's doing an experiment gets a balloon on their desk, right? So you walk into their huge claims office. I mean, this was before the pandemic. Maybe it's all at home now, I don't know. But I mean, it looks like a flippin' birthday party, right? It's like everybody's job is, if it doesn't work as well as it should, fix it. We'll help you, and let us know when you've done it.
That's great. And we've talked, haven't we, about that problem solving, attracting talented people to your team.
Absolutely. Because you know what happens? You know, I mean, everybody working in any company, I promise you, there's stuff that doesn't work very well. What do? They go and whine about it in the tea room, right? Or they whine about it over the photocopier or whatever. Or, the tail end of the Zoom call when there are only two of you left. So they whine and they complain, and actually you want to change the culture. So no, if it doesn't work well enough, come and tell us how you're going to fix it. Or tell us what you need. Who do you need to work with you to make this better? But get ahead of the problem. We are way behind. Our productivity in the UK is lamentable, but certainly in terms of all the horrific side effects of climate change, we're behind. We need to speed up. We're coming back to the Montreal Protocol. We need everybody, and we need to aim at the best imaginable. And we can't dick around.
Yeah.
It's a technical term.
And taking those forward. And I know throughout the day we're going to be walking towards those pain points. So I'll be interested to see what comes up and encourage everybody to be leaning into those. We've got just under 5 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you if there were any messages you could leave us with today that you'd like people to take away with them. What would they be?
I think the main one would be everybody in your company is creative. We're all born creative. We're living in the world that we live in because all of human history is creative. People in companies get horribly, horribly typecast and boxed in. They get boxed in by job descriptions, KPIs, targets, incentive, all the mumbo-jumbo of so-called scientific management, right? It's catastrophically destructive of creativity, because if I have 500 KPIs I have to fulfill by a date, and I don't get my bonus if I don't, if I have an idea, which is unlikely because I'll be too busy or tired, But if I have an idea, it just doesn't make the cut. I mean, personally, in the companies that I've run, I've never given people bonuses. I've never used KPIs. I've never used targets except for deadlines. And I have said, look, if you have an idea of how we could be doing what we're doing better in any way at all, whether it's the parental leave policy, whether it's the coffee in the coffee machine, I don't care what it is, speak up. If it's an improvement or we think it could be an improvement, we'll go for it. Everybody is an innovator. Don't ghettoize it in R&D. I completely understand there are very complex projects that need very specific, specialized skills. But in the crisis in which we find ourselves, we need everybody.
And who do you look for for inspiration?
I look to artists, partly because I've just spent a year and a half of my life writing a book about artists. Right? But also I spent a lot of my career working with deeply creative people. And so I eventually sat down and said, okay, what is it about the way that artists work that is so compelling? And, very short answer. First of all, they are unbelievably, insatiably curious. They move towards uncertainty because that's where they know there are discoveries to be made. In that respect, they are exactly like scientists. Right? If something's ambiguous, there's a lot of stuff in there. It's worth paying attention to. Secondly, they start before they're asked. Nobody generally, people don't ask me to write books, right? Well, somebody did ask me to write this book. But anyway, the other books, I wanted to write them. So they have a deep sense of self-motivation, intrinsic motivation, agency. Everything they do is hard. Everything they do is hard. Every book I've ever written is hard. It's always going to be the book where I discover I'm not up to it, right? But they keep going. And they keep going often when no plan is visible. Murakami writes his novels not knowing what the plot is when he starts. Lee Child writes his thrillers not knowing what the plot is when he starts. I don't understand how anybody does this, but they do. Olga Tokarczuk, who wrote this fantastic kind of murder mystery novel, very weird, called Drive Your Plow Over My Bones, didn't know till she was 2/3 of the way through writing it who'd done it. And she was surprised, right? This is a high tolerance for ambiguity.
Yeah.
And they keep going, and they keep going, and they keep going. And then when they get there, they don't know if it's a success or not. If it sells a lot of books, does that mean it's a great book? Does it mean it was just the right moment? Did it have the right cover? It could be a million things, right? And the other thing I really respect artists for so much is so often when they're really being celebrated as fantastic, they decide to change. Why? Because they don't want to repeat themselves. Because if you repeat yourself, you're not learning anything, and they're highly driven to learn. And I think artists are our role models in this crisis, because all of those qualities of curiosity, resilience, persistence, courage, change, the capacity to change, the capacity to support each other, those are the things we need more than anything else right now.
Yeah, amazing, totally. Well, thank you very much for your inspiring words. I didn't think we'd be talking about artists at the beginning of this, so it's a great statement to end on. So thank you everybody for listening. I would encourage you to look up Margaret's work and this book that she was just mentioning, which is called Embracing Uncertainty, How Writers, Musicians, Art and Artists Thrive in an Uncertain World. And that's out on the 25th of March. Well, I think you'll all join me in thanking Margaret for her time today.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much.